Always curious, Professor George Washington Carver committed his life to scholarship, community, and the integration of his Christian faith with higher education. It's in this spirit we welcome you to Carver Classrooms.
Hello and welcome to this Carver Classroom course on science, peace, and leadership. I'm Joshua Swamidass. I'm a scientist and a professor here at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm also a Christian and a faculty fellow of the Carver Project. This course seeks to explore how Christians can engage with science thoughtfully and faithfully while seeking opportunities to make peace where there's conflict and lead others to do the same. In the second session, we're going to discuss the pastoral challenge of science with an eye towards seekers and students. In important domains, there's been a long history of conflict between the church and science, as much as we might want to pursue integration. And we can't ignore that conflict if we care about the needs of students and seekers. So personally, I was drawn to science from a young age, but I also found a great deal of conflict there with my faith. In many ways, it was an epistemological challenge. Science really presented the question of how do you know that your faith is really true and not just something that is your preference or what you were raised with? What's the evidence behind your faith? It created a great deal of insecurity and confusion in me, especially because of the wide divergence between the origin narrative as I'd been taught it in Genesis and what I hear in science class. And that was a real challenge that I had to work through. And my experience was not unique. When we think about our students and how so many of them are leaving the faith when they go to college or they leave the house or the church, there's been studies done on this. There's a book called You Lost Me by David Kinnaman, and he summarizes the research done to understand why it is that Christian-raised children so often leave the faith. And among the top reasons that they gave were a perceived conflict between mainstream science and their faith. And so that's important. This is the reason why people are working through and trying to make sense of this. Now, the way how this sort of conflict is navigated by most churches, at least I've observed, is one of two ways. On one hand, maybe most churches just try and avoid these topics. They want to avoid the conflict that comes with it because there's disagreement in the church on these topics. On the other hand, there's some Christian contexts that just lean heavy into disputing the mainstream scientific view of these things, and they set themselves up in opposition to it. So what that leaves students like me and seekers with is really a great deal of conflict that they're seeing in public, and not really any healthy context in how to work through towards integration. To understand those conflicts, it's not just a contemporary problem. These are conflicts that have a really deep history. One example is human origins, which I keep coming back to, which is exemplified in the Scopes monkey trial from about 100 years ago. If you've watched the movie Inherit the Wind, you know a little bit about it, but it was a fight about whether or not evolution should be taught in public schools. And in more recent times, there was the Dover trial when people were still having those sorts of debates and fights. And that history impacts us now. It's something that we inherit and we take with us into our current moment. And it's why this is more than just personal conflicts or personal takes on this. There's a history that we're speaking out of and that we have to engage as we think about these things too. And it has a big impact. I want to tell you about one story that really changed how I engage with faith and science. It was from a few years ago when I was a professor at Washington University early on, before I had tenure. And I heard about a postdoc that was attending a student ministry I was involved with. He was from China. His wife was a Christian, and he was really curious about Jesus. And so he went to the campus ministry on Friday nights, and there he heard about Jesus and found that Jesus was good, and he was really curious. And then on Sundays, he would attend a Chinese church that was very, very anti-evolution. And he heard that he wasn't really going to be able to follow Jesus unless he was willing to reject evolution. And he took this seriously. He went back and forth between these two places, curious about Jesus, but then also confused by our anti-evolutionism. And the pastor that he talked to on Sunday was just very convinced that he had strong scientific evidence against evolution, and it was not faithful to accept it, even though as a scientist, he wasn't finding those arguments convincing. And he went back and forth for a year. And eventually he got tired and the demands of work took over, and he stopped seeking. And in a lot of ways, that's what happens when we go with the two dominant ways of engaging these things. On one hand, many Christian contexts will lean heavy into the conflict and think that the solution is to argue against mainstream science. On the other hand, there's a large number of Christians, maybe most, that are trying to just avoid the conflict, so they don't really ever talk about it. This really leaves seekers and students in this place of having to navigate it themselves, navigate a pretty complicated minefield in a way that, they can really take a lot of damage. And, hearing that story, knowing that postdoc, seeing that play out, changed things for me. I realized that, I need to be able to enter that minefield and navigate it and clear some minds. And think about what is a more direct way to engage rather than just avoiding it to avoid the conflict. So in summary, we live in a scientific world and science matters. Science presents a real pastoral challenge that we can't ignore and we need to engage. In this next session, we're going to think more about how the gospel might shift and change how we can relate to science and meet this particular challenge.